Coaches, managers, and modern workers spend an insane amount of time in meetings. CEOs spend an amazing 72% of work time in meetings. And if you're a coach, potentially you have hundreds of clients for which you need to remember what was discussed, action items from previous meetings, and maybe you also want to send out a summary of what was discussed in your coaching calls. This video is for you if you want to build AI automations targeting coaches, managers, consultants, or any team that's drowning in meetings. Today, we're going to be building an N8N workflow that uses Fireflies.ai to automatically get meeting transcripts using GraphQL. It's going to generate AI meeting summaries and pull out action items, and we're also going to build a structured, searchable Airtable database of every meeting. My name's Owen. I have 15 years experience in tech as a manager and a software engineer. Today, I'm going to be building a system with you step by step, so you'll see the exact process. All right, so before we get started, I just want to quickly show you what we're going to be building. Essentially, what we're going to do is we're going to use the Fireflies API to get any transcripts from the meetings that we've been in. And we are going to get the transcripts using the API. We're going to process them using an LLM to normalize the transcript. We can also generate summary notes as well from that meeting transcript. And then finally, we're going to push that into an Airtable database. What's good about using this approach is that once we have the meetings, so what we can do is we can grab the transcripts and then we can push them into a database. But now that we have them in a database, we can do other automations with this. So we can, for example, use that database of meeting transcripts to generate content ideas. So we can generate content. We can also use these meeting notes. We could push them into, for example, Slack so that you can keep your team updated. And you could also potentially send these out via email to your coaching clients as well, so they get a summary of what was discussed. The good thing about this approach, once we put all of this data into a database, we can have a manual check. So before we send out our transcripts of our meetings to our clients, we probably want to do a bit of manual checking. Maybe we want to edit the notes in some way. So this allows you to do that. Essentially, it uses AI and automation, but it keeps a human in the loop throughout the process. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the automation. So essentially what this is doing, we've configured our Fireflies API key, and I'll show you how to get one. Then we get our user ID. Once we have our user ID, we get a list of transcripts. Once we have a list of transcripts, we then split for each transcript. We are going to grab the transcript and the full conversation history, and then we're going to pass that into an LLM, which is then going to process that transcript and turn it into something that's more structured. We then push that into another LLM, which is going to summarize and extract key action items and generate a more concise summary of the meeting. And then finally, we're going to push that into an Airtable database. Okay, so let's just run this automation and see what it does. Okay, so the first thing we do, we get our API key, we get our user ID, and then we get a list of transcripts. So you can see here, these are the transcripts that we have. In the last 7 days, I've had 2 meetings and it's picked up on those. Then we get a specific transcript, which is going to look a little bit like this. You can see that we have a title, we have a date, which is interesting because we're going to need to process this later. It's actually a number. Then we have a list of the meeting attendees, and then we have the actual transcript. Notice that this isn't a very usable format that we're getting back from the API. So this is where we're going to need to do some processing. It's a JSON object, which contains the speaker name and then the text for what was said during the meeting. Obviously, if we want to use this for content generation or any other kind of summarization, we need to turn this into a more structured bit of text. The next step in the chain is to essentially summarize the transcript. So we have a prompt here that says, you are a helpful meeting assistant. You will be given a transcript. And then we are pulling out a summary and then obviously a list of action items as well. And then once we have that data, we're going to push it into an Airtable database, which I've created over here, which has an ID. This is going to be the transcript ID so that we can know if we've updated it or not. We have a list of participants, and then we have the transcript and a set of meeting notes. Once we have all of the data into our database, we can then do some post-processing. So I have a field here for selected. So if, for example, I wanted to do something with these meeting notes, I could use this field to essentially control another automation later on. Okay, so before we get started using the Fireflies API, we will need to get an API key. And the way we do that is we click here, and then you can see in your developer settings, you should be able to get an API key. The other thing you can do as well with the Fireflies API is you can have a webhook. So you can either manually pull down the transcripts, or you can have a webhook such that whenever a meeting is finished and a transcript is generated, it will call the webhook and trigger some kind of automation. We're going to do it manually today because I generally prefer that approach, but you can do it either way. The other thing to notice with Fireflies.ai is their documentation. They have documentation on using their API. This uses GraphQL. So the first thing to be aware of with the Fireflies API is that it's using GraphQL. GraphQL is essentially an alternative to a model like REST, where we can define explicitly what data we want to get back. So rather than getting all of the data back, we can choose very specific bits of data that we want to get back. So you can see here in this example, we're making a call to the Fireflies API. We're using a post request. And what we're doing here is we're specifying we want only the name and the user ID. So there may be a large number of fields, but we're only choosing the specific data we want to get back. If you want to understand what specific data you can pull back from Fireflies, you can look in the schema. And so, for example, the transcript has a whole bunch of fields that we can pull back. So the ID, the title, the participants, a whole bunch of other information about that meeting. You can basically use this API to select the specific data that you want to get back. All right, so this meeting automation has finished. And what it's done is it's basically transcribed the meeting. It's got the meeting transcription. And then we also have some meeting notes as well. So the transcription now is in plain text. So this is easy for us to work with. We have the speaker name and then what was said. And then we also have some meeting notes as well, which in this case is just summarizing what we spoke about and then also generating action items. This is obviously just for demonstration. The great thing about this approach, you can do whatever you want with this. You can generate the meeting summary in any format you like. Fireflies does actually generate a transcription for you. So you can see here, this was the meeting. It's given a sort of a breakdown of the meeting. But the thing about that is it may not have the right information you need. It may not be in the format you want to give to your clients. Maybe you want to add some additional information, whatever it is. If you want to customize that summary of the meeting, this is how you do it with AI and automation. All right, so let's just take a quick look at the API and see if we can build something ourselves. So firstly, we're going to start off with a manual trigger. And then the first thing we're going to need to do is to get back, make a call to the Fireflies API. So the first thing we're going to need to do is set our API key. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to add a field. I'm going to call this Fireflies API key. And then obviously you would paste in your own API key here. Okay, so I'm going to paste in mine. And then when we run the step, we get back our API key. Then we're going to make a request to the Fireflies API. So we're going to make a HTTP request. If we go back to the documentation, you should see, let's go back to the quick start. You should see the rough parameters you need. You're always going to be making a post request. You need to pass your API key in as a header. So there's an authorization header with your API key. And then you also need to pass in the actual query. This is the endpoint we want to make a request to. So let's go and set this up. We want to make a post request to the Fireflies GraphQL endpoint. We're going to set a header, and the header is going to be authorization. The value is going to be bearer and then your API token. So what we're going to do, we're going to make this an expression, and then we're going to pull in the API key from down here, and that looks correct. So we have authorization, bearer, and then your API key. And then we also need to send a body as well. So I'm going to define this as JSON. Okay, so the first request we're going to make is to get back the user ID. So I'm going to get back my own user ID because we're going to need that to make subsequent calls. So we're going to say query, and then we're going to paste in user ID. Okay, so I've obviously made a mistake here. I think I have an extra. I need to just close this out. All right, so this is our query. We're going to call the Fireflies API and get back our user ID. So there we go. So this is our user ID, which we're now going to use in a subsequent step. Let's just quickly rename this to be get user ID. All right, so the next thing we're going to need to do, let's also rename this quickly to get API key. So the next thing we're going to need to do is make a HTTP request to get a list of the transcripts that have happened in the last several days. You could either trigger this manually or you could run it on a cron where you run this every day. And if so, you want to get back the transcripts that have been created in the last 24 hours. So again, we're going to make a post request. And the post request is going to be to this endpoint. Again, we're going to set the header. I'm going to call this authorization. And we're going to pass in our API key again. All right. So now we have our API key. We're going to send in the body of the request. And we're going to use JSON. Okay, so I just want to quickly show you some of the queries that we're going to be using to call the API. So what we need to do, first thing we need to do is get a list of the transcripts. And then the second thing we need to do is for each transcript ID, we're going to go and fetch the transcript. So this first query is using GraphQL. We have a query which is going to call the transcripts resource. We're passing in the user ID and a from date. So the user ID is what we got in the previous step. And the from date is going to be using the built-in N8N functions. We just need to pass in an ISO compatible date string. So the way we do this is we say now dot minus 7 days. So this is going to be 7 days ago. And we're going to convert that into an ISO string. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. You can change this to whatever you want. If you want to run this automation every day, you can make that 1 day, whatever you need. And then the second thing we need to do is using the data we got back in this step, we're going to make another query to the API to get the transcript, and we're going to pass in the transcript ID, and we're going to pull back these specific fields. So we're going to get back the title, the ID, the date, the meeting attendees, specifically their email addresses, and then also the sentences as well. This is basically the text of the transcript. We're going to get the speaker name and the text. So as you can see, the thing about GraphQL is you have to specify the data that you want to get back. Two other things that are worth mentioning in this automation. The first thing is when we get back the meeting attendees, we get back those as JSON. And so we need to transform them into a string. And what we're doing is we're getting back a list of data, which you'll see in a second. And we're going to convert that when we store it in Airtable in the database. We want to turn that into a string. That is basically the email address, comma, and then the other email address. The way we do that is we can map over the items. We can get the email address, and then we can use this JavaScript function called join, which will turn all of those items in an array, and it'll turn it into a string, which is separated by commas. The other thing to be aware of, you may have seen that the date we got back from the Fireflies API is a number, which is a Unix timestamp. In order to store this date into Airtable, we're going to want to turn it into a string. And the way we do that is we can say date time from from milliseconds. We essentially get the date, and then we can call this toISO function. I'll show you how this works in a second. Don't be scared by this. But essentially what we're doing is we're taking the date format that we got from GraphQL, from Fireflies, and we're turning it into a string. This is quite common where sometimes the data you get back from an API isn't exactly what you want. And these built-in N8N functions just really, really useful and powerful for transforming the data without writing any kind of complicated code. All right, so let's get back to our first example. So this request is going to be get transcripts. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to paste in the GraphQL query from before. We need to make this an expression. And then when we expand this expression out, you can see what we're doing here. We're calling Fireflies. We're making this query, and then we're injecting the user ID and the from date. So find me all transcripts for this user ID that were created after this particular date, which was 7 days ago. And here you can see this toISO function in action. We are basically turning this into a string. If we remove this, you can see here what we have is an N8N date time, but this is not going to be any use. We can't send that to the Fireflies API. We need to turn that into a string. And the way you do that is to call toISO, which you can see here is just formatting that date string. All right, so let's give this a try and see if it works. That seems to be working well. So you can see here, we got back a list of the meeting transcripts that were created in the last 7 days. And so the next thing we need to do is for each of these meeting IDs or the transcript IDs, we need to go and actually fetch the transcript. So let's do that in the next step. So the way we're going to do this, we're going to use a node in N8N called split out. And what this is going to do is iterate through each of these transcripts one by one. So let's put this up here. And then when we split this out, we get a list of all of the items. And we're going to go through these one by one. And so we need to make another HTTP request. We're going to rename this to be get transcript. We're going to make a post request. We're going to make it to the same URL as we did before. And we're going to add our header. We're going to pass in our API key. We're going to fix this again. First.json.Fireflies API key. And again, we need to pass in our query. So we're going to make this JSON. We're going to define the JSON structure below. And I'm just going to paste in the query. I'm going to make this an expression again, and we're going to expand this out. So what we're doing in this next call, we're getting a transcript. We're passing in the transcript ID, which is coming from the previous step. And then we are selecting the data that we want to get back. So in this case, we want the title of the meeting, the ID, the date, the meeting attendees, and then obviously the actual text of the transcript itself. So let's run this step. All right, perfect. So we have all the data we need. Again, this transcript is not in the format that we need. We want to store this as a plain text transcript in our database. So we're going to use an LLM to basically format this data. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add an LLM. We're going to add a basic LLM chain, and we're going to call this format transcript. And the thing we need to do here is essentially pass in this transcript and convert it to plain text. So I'm going to say, convert this transcript to plain text in this format. Speaker name 1, text. Speaker name 2, text. So we just want this format to be text, essentially. And then here is the transcript. So we need to pass in the sentences. So the transcript is here, the speaker name, and then the text. But what we want to do is normalize this. So when you first look at this data, if we expand this out, what you'll see is we just get back a bunch of objects. That's because we need to either go through this data one by one, or we need to do something with it. So what we're going to do is use a function called JSON-stringify, JSON.stringify. And then we're going to wrap all of that data. And what that will do is it'll go through that JSON structure and just essentially turn it into a big string, which you can see here. Now that we have all of the data, we can now pass that into an LLM to work with. All right, so now that we have that data, we can test this step. We need to connect a model. I'm going to use Gemini's latest model because it has a really large context window. So I'm going to use Gemini 2.5 Pro. 2.5 Pro experimental. This is the latest model from Google, and it's really, really good. Fantastic AI model. It has a massive context window, which allows you to pass in really large transcripts, essentially. So we're going to use that model. And let's just see what this does. All right, so I'm actually getting back an error from Gemini. So let's try a different model. Let's try Gemini Flash, because I think that'll be better. We don't need the smartest model. So let's try Gemini 2 Flash. I also wonder, so this took a really long time and it basically failed. So I wonder whether we can normalize the data a bit more. So what I'm passing in here is quite a lot of data. I wonder if there's a way to format this better. Let's have a quick look. I think a better approach here would probably be to use code, because it's quite a lot of data to pass into a large language model, and it's very structured in terms of what we're trying to do. So I think this would actually be better doing it in code. But for the sake of this, let me just try one idea. So what I might do is to take the transcript. Let's just try this. All right, so what I might do here is try and map, and let's call it X. And then what we might do is X dot Okay, so what we might do is X dot name. Is that right? So speaker name plus string plus X dot text. Okay, let's see what that does. All right, so that's actually pretty good. We've simplified the data. So previously I was doing this in an LLM. I think it's actually better to use these built-in native functions. This is just a really good example of where deciding how you do these in automations is really valuable, because you can either use an LLM, which can be quite slow and quite unpredictable, or you can use some of the built-in functions like code or some of these native operations in N8N, which are going to be much more reliable and much faster as well. So let's see if we can also tidy this up a bit. So we can join this into a string, and we can join it with a new line. All right, so this is actually good. So previously I was doing this with an LLM, but you can see here, this is basically doing exactly the same thing. It's incredibly fast, and it's exactly the data we need. And I don't have to pass this through to an LLM. So I think this is a really good example of where sometimes you can over-rely on these large language models to do basic data transformation. And it's much better to use some of these built-in functions. So I'm going to keep this step. So I don't even need to have this LLM at this stage. The only thing I need this LLM for is perhaps to summarize. So let's call this summarize meeting. So the only thing I'm going to use here is use Gemini to summarize the meeting. So let's make this simple. So please generate a summary of this meeting in the following format. Summary is going to be 3 to 4 sentence. Summary, action items, summary, 3 to 4 sentence summary of the meeting and what was discussed, and action items, a list of action items from the meeting. You could obviously improve this prompt pretty substantially. I'm just going to do this to be quick. Here is the transcript. And then I'm going to pass in the transcripts here. Transcript. I'm going to use an XML tag because I think that's a good way to do it. It keeps the data nice and organized. So what we need to do is execute that previous step. So let's have a look at how to do this. All right, so here is the transcript. So this is what I need to pass in. All right, so we're passing in the transcript. Please generate a summary. Let's see what we do. We're using Gemini Flash. So let's see if we can generate a summary of the meeting. Let's see what the output was. Okay, that's strange. It's not actually pulling out the right thing. Let's make sure we're passing in all of the data. Please generate a summary of the meeting. It's a transcript. Let's try a different model. Let's use Let's use Gemini 2.5 Pro. And let's run this. All right, I was actually trying to use Gemini Pro, and for some reason it's being incredibly slow. I'm going to try a different model. Let's use GPT-4o. Let's try it using a different model. Okay, it looks like it's done a much better job using GPT-4o. Looks like Google's having some issues. It's pulled out the action items. This looks good. We've got a good summary of the meeting. So now we have a transcript, we have a summary, and then the next thing we want to do is push this back into Airtable. So let me just go to my database. What I'm going to do is I'm going to clean out the database. So now that we've got our transcripts, we've generated a summary, we want to push those into Airtable. So let's find an Airtable node. We're going to use the create or update a record. And what we're going to do is we're going to choose our meetings database. And the table here is called meetings. And we need to match on a column. What this is used for is basically within Airtable, if we run this automation multiple times and we already have the data in Airtable, we don't want to overwrite it and we don't want to create a duplicate record. So we're going to use the ID to match on, and the column we're going to use to match on is the transcript ID. So the transcript ID comes from the transcript itself. And let's delete this ID. The participants, as you can see here, the meeting attendees, this is where we need to use another N8N built-in function. The meeting attendees is a JSON object. What we want to store in Airtable is a string with the names or the email addresses in a comma-separated string. So this is where we need to use that approach I mentioned before. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass in this expression here. And you can see here what we're doing is we're taking that JSON structure where we have this JSON structure, and we're going to turn it into a string like this. So the way we do this is we call the JavaScript map function. So we take the attendees and then we go through those attendees. We get the item, we get the email into an array, and then we join that together as a string using this method here called join. So this is just really useful. Definitely worth spending some time with the built-in N8N functions. They're so powerful and so useful. Okay, so that's the list of participants. The next thing I'm going to pass in is the actual transcript. So we need the meeting summary, which is going to be here. The only thing I didn't get was the transcript. I was using a different method to get this transcript. So this is what I was using to get the plain text transcript, this little JSON snippet. So I'm going to pass that into here, make this an expression. Okay, so I need to change this. All right, so what we need to do is we need to get the sentences. And then for each of those sentences, we're going to map over them to get the name and then a colon and then the text. We're going to build this into a giant array, and then we're going to use a string operation to join them together. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Yep, perfect. So if you're confused by any of these functions, I can cover them in a different video, but essentially what we're doing here is we're taking that JavaScript object, we're going through each of the items in the object, and we're turning it into a different data structure, which we're just taking the name, and then we have a colon, and then we have the text, and then we're using this join function to turn it into a string separated by new line characters. So that should all be working. I think as a final improvement, I'm generating the transcript in this way multiple times. So I think it's better to do a set node, which we'll show you in a second. So let's just run this step. Okay, and this should have put the data into Airtable. Looks like it's working correctly. We have the transcript in the format we want. And we also have the meeting notes summary. This is what we discussed, and then here are the action items. So that all seems to be working fine. Just as a final improvement, we could probably define this transcript somewhere else. We could kind of set that once rather than repeating it multiple times. Otherwise, I think this is basically working as expected. Okay, just the final section. If you're curious about any of the N8N functions I was using in this automation, you can check out the documentation for N8N. There are a whole load of built-in expressions for transforming data inside your automations. And so much of what we do in terms of coding, programming, and automation is about transforming data from one format into another format. And there's a whole bunch of these built-in functions that you should get acquainted with. So as you can see here for dates, there's a way of taking a date and changing the format of that date. There's all kinds of clever logic you can do that's built in here. And then same thing for strings as well. There's a whole bunch of string operations that you can learn. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. Remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.